Hello, everybody. Welcome to Sharpening Your Skills with CloudAhoy. This is the presentation that was given during the Spirit of Aviation Week 2020, a celebration of aviation that was done in lieu of us being able to go to Oshkosh this year. My name is Ty Schuff. I am the customer liaison at CloudAhoy. I currently hold a private pilot's license with an instrument rating. My role here at CloudAhoy is to work with our larger customers, our smaller customers. I handle software testing, I handle documentation, and in general, I try to just be the voice of the customer inside our organization. If you have any questions and want to contact me, you're welcome to reach out to me via ty@cloudahoy.com, and I'll have some more methods for contacting us and getting assistance at the end of this presentation. So to talk a little bit about what we're going to talk about today, we're going to start by giving everybody a brief overview of what is CloudAhoy. We're going to cover the user interface briefly, just to make sure we are all on the same page. And the vast majority of our talk today will be spent looking at live debriefs. These are flights that many flights that I personally flew, and just walking through how I debrief them as a pilot. So let's start by talking about what is CloudAhoy. CloudAhoy is a tool for performing data-driven post-flight debriefs. What we do is we take in flight data from a variety of different sources, iOS and Android apps, your electronic flight bags like ForeFlight and Garmin Pilot, handheld GPS devices such as Bad Elf, flight simulators, directly out of AirPlay and avionics, and pretty much any way that you may want to record your flight. We take that flight data and we merge it with information about aerodromes, published approaches, NOAA wind information, aircraft performance V speeds, and things of that nature, and more. We then perform analysis on that data and automatically identify which segments existed and assign scores to those segments where applicable. So the secret sauce of CloudAhoy is the automatic segmentation. We look at your flight, we analyze it, and we say, that looks like it's a steep turn. That looks like it was an instrument approach. That looks like it was a chandelle, and make those maneuvers easily accessible to you as the pilot. For several of our maneuvers, we also offer automatic scoring. You'll prominently see those on both instrument and visual approaches, and we're also going to look at some examples of steep turns today that are using our automatic scoring algorithm. Pulling in data from a number of different data sources, like your airspeed and your altitude and your headings, and pretty much anything that you would need to think of that would be used to evaluate a particular maneuver. We then combine all of this data and all of this analysis into our very powerful visualization engine that allows you to look at your flight in 2D and 3D, as well as visualize the data on a graph or just take a look at the raw data. Automatic scoring allows us to perform an objective evaluation of proficiency and safety. It does not replace our CFI. It's there to assist our CFI in identifying areas where maybe we need to improve or areas where we did very well during our flight. Automatic scoring looks at things like your indicated airspeed, looks at your sink rate, it looks at your descent angle on an approach, and combines all those parameters together to provide you with a score. And to say, this is how you performed on your flight, this is how you performed on a maneuver, or even this is how your indicated airspeed was during this particular maneuver. Automatic scoring is a feature that is included with CloudAhoy Pro level subscription. To sign up for CloudAhoy, we offer 2 tiers of subscription, CloudAhoy Pro and CloudAhoy Standard. We do have a free subscription, or we do have a free offering that is CloudAhoy Track. All new users are given a 35-day free trial of CloudAhoy Pro. No credit card is required for that. So let's get into talking about the CloudAhoy user interface. The user interface of CloudAhoy is broken up into several distinct areas. Areas where we will manage the debrief, areas where we will navigate the debrief, and areas where we will actually perform the debrief. At the top section of the interface, we have buttons for creating a new view, for managing our layout, for managing our V speeds, and also for switching to different portions or different parts of the CloudAhoy app to say, go look at your flights or go look at your account. On the left side of the screen, we have our tools pane. And in the tools pane, we have access to all of our scoring information. So all of our maneuvers will be scored and placed in this pane. We have access to flight graphs. We also have access to our segments manager, where we can see each one of the segments that were flown during a flight. Through this pane, we can also add and remove and manage instrument approaches that were automatically identified or those that you added after the fact. And at the very bottom, we have our timeline. And the timeline allows us to scrub forward and backward in the flight, to play the flight back in real time, or to add time acceleration as we play the flight back. Finally, in the middle, we have the core of CloudAhoy, the debrief area. This is where all of your debrief panes or all of your debrief views will show up. Your views such as your 3D cockpit view in this case, the 2D track view in the upper left-hand corner, the segment information view in the very bottom. All the windows that you open up and manage will be placed in this area. Each of these windows can be closed, they can be moved, they can be resized. We can have more information or less information depending on what you need for your debrief. So a little bit of background out of the way. Let's go ahead now and move into the actual debriefs. So today we're going to talk about a number of flights. The vast majority of these flights are those that I flew. And my goal with this presentation is that I'm going to show you how I debrief flights as an experienced and proficient pilot and provide value to you beyond flight training. We are going to take some time and talk about a couple of flight training flights because that is certainly something that is of interest to both CFIs and students and experienced pilots as well to be able to evaluate their performance on those types of flights. And then I have a couple of additional examples where we're going to look at some rich data coming in to see how else we can look at in debrief flights within CloudAhoy. So, like everybody else, I have been impacted by COVID-19. There was a 3-month gap in my flying from the beginning of March through the beginning of June. I made the decision not to go flying because of the uncertainty that was in the world. However, I also recognize that flying is a skill, and flying is a skill that needs to be practiced. So while we were in we'll call it the off season, I did a lot of work on my desktop flight simulator. I was flying around with X-Plane 11. I was flying a lot on Pilot Edge or VATSIM. And I was using CloudAhoy to debrief most of my flights. During these flights, I was doing VFR work. I was doing instrument work. Or I would just hop into a 747 and go, just go somewhere. And all of this was kind of for fun and also in preparation for when I finally got back into the cockpit, to make sure that I was as proficient as I was going to be the moment that I stepped back in. And everybody kind of has their own way of preparing to go back after a long drought. But for me, the simulator helped immensely, and I felt pretty confident when I jumped back in the airplane. So the first flight that we're going to look at is actually my first flight after my 3-month COVID-19 gap. I went up in this flight by myself, and I had three main goals. I wanted to focus on the very, very basics. Climbs and descents, straight and level flight. Just make sure that I had basic control over the airplane again. I wanted to do some practice with some basic maneuvers as well. So I did some steep turns. I did some slow flight. I did some coordinated turns in slow flight and things of that nature. And finally, I wanted to actually get my VFR currency back, which meant landing at three airports, or having 3 landings in my logbook. So I took this opportunity to go to 3 different airports where I could practice ATC communication, entering the pattern, and also landing. So we're going to take a look at this flight and just look at the trends and how I did on my flight here. So the first thing my first goal was to go over how my landings were. And using CFI Assistant, we can see that landings were pretty consistent. We had a 93 going into Portsmouth, an 84 into Lawrence, and a 94 going into Beverly. So I'm going to take a look at the Portsmouth flight, which we've already chosen here. I'm going to drop down the CFI Assistant scoring pane, and I'm really just kind of concerned with, okay, I did very well with my speed. I did very well with my sync rate. It looks like I had some issues with my descent angle. It looks like I had some issues with my centerline deviation on final. And if we take a look at the graphs, the green being altitude and the blue being speed, we do see some variation in my sync rate. It looks like I started off high above our computed glide path, and I ended up a little bit shallow coming into the airport. I'll also say that I was holding a little bit more speed as I was coming in on short final than I would have liked to have. I was running 75 knots as opposed to 65 to 70 knots. And as a result, I ended up floating this way down the runway. If I click on the info button here, I can see that my touchdown didn't actually happen until 1,721 feet. And my goal, of course, was to land closer to 1,000 feet. So that was the first thing I looked at and said, well, maybe that landing obviously wasn't the greatest. Even though we scored a 93, there were still some things that I needed to work on. And it looked like it was a result of me setting up on my final coming in. So then let's go ahead and head over to the Lawrence flight, or the Lawrence landing. So we'll flip over to that. And if we take a look at the graph, first of all, what we're seeing is the airspeed was kind of maybe a little inconsistent, but not bad. The sync rate appears to be a little bit better, but we're still seeing some dips and we're still seeing some humps on the way down. Drop the scoring down and we'll see the same sort of thing. In this case, my indicated airspeed was a little bit slow below 500 feet, so I kind of overcompensated for what I did last time and slowed myself down. My descent angle and centerline deviation, however, were also a little bit off as well. So that's something I'm going to keep in mind now. There's 2 landings that we've had where we've had some issues with descent angle and centerline deviation. Head on over to the last flight. Coming into Beverly, scored very, very well. I'm seeing similar trends in the graph, so I'm probably going to say, yep, the descent angle and centerline deviation were an issue. So looking at my 3 landings coming in here, I've identified a trend that coming back from this break, I'm basically above the glide path as I'm making my initial turn to final, and I'm getting below the glide path as I'm getting a little bit close. And I'm not getting a nice straight descent on the way down. I'm also banking left and right a little bit. I think it was maybe a little windy day. That's the excuse I'm going to use for that. But that's certainly something I want to keep in mind as a trend for these 3 landings that I did. Next thing I worked on were my steep turns. So we'll take a look at the steep turns. Just switch to my turn here to the right. And we'll look at CFI Assistant. And we'll see, well, maybe that wasn't the greatest steep turn in the world. My altitude was 0 to plus 152, so I was definitely outside of the limits of what I was after. We can confirm that visually by looking at this red section where I was more than 100 feet above my entry altitude. As a result of climbing during that turn, my speed also came way back. You can see where I dipped below more than 10 knots below my entry speed at a low of 81 knots. And my roll in and roll out headings were also not great. So for my first time being back, that steep turn maybe needed some work. And we'll go look at the one here to the left, and we'll see, hey, this one was apparently flown a lot better. So I held my altitude very well. That was my focus. But I did let my airspeed get away from me, and I didn't do a great job with my roll in and my roll out headings. So coming out of my steep turns, I can say, well, I need to focus on altitude. I probably need to add a little bit more power as I'm rolling into that turn. And I need to focus on my entry and my exit point on my headings. The last thing I was curious about, and this is where, as an experienced pilot, okay, we look at our flight and we're good to go. But the last thing I was curious about for this flight was my climb. So I did a nice, long, beautiful climb over the Atlantic Ocean just because I wanted to get out and do it. But I was trying to hold as straight as possible, going up to 6,500, 7,000 feet before I then came back down. So I'm just going to visually look at this line here and see that I did a reasonably good job holding my straight line. A couple of times I deviated a little bit right and a little bit left, but overall I felt pretty good about that. And I point that out because that was just one of the goals that I had going into this particular flight. I felt pretty good with the flight overall. So that flight was recorded using only a GPS device. I record all of my personal flights using my iPad, running ForeFlight. And for the flight that you saw there, I was using the Garmin flight stream. For other flights, I use the internal GPS of the iPad, and I get pretty good results. When we think about how to record flights in a CloudAhoy, GPS-only devices are kind of the most basic. And we can go more and more and more complex until we actually record the raw data from the G1000 itself. But using only GPS data, and that flight as an example, CloudAhoy is able to compute the indicated airspeed based on wind information in the area. We're able to compute the pitch and roll based on our turn rate and wind information, and a whole lot more. So what you're seeing depicted, while maybe not exactly reality in the case of an indicated airspeed, is very, very, very close approximation to what you'll see or what you were seeing in the real airplane. So the next flight I want to talk about was an IFR Currency flight. This was before the days of COVID. I shot 3 approaches and 1 hold in this particular flight. And again, we're looking at these as the guise of somebody who is experienced flying, experienced with CloudAhoy, and just wants to say, how did I do? So for the first approach here, the Arnav Bravo into the Gardner Airport, I came in from Keene, so we came in from the northwest here, and I'm looking at my hold. My hold entry, I feel pretty good about. I was deviating just a little bit away from the hold on the outbound leg, but I felt pretty good. I can see that I went outside the center line as I turned back in, or I overshot just a little bit, but that's all right. I'm still pretty happy with how the hold was flown. So let's look at the instrument approach itself. So the instrument approach scored a 72. If we break down the score here, what we see is that some crossing altitude issues happened during the flight. There was some issues with inconsistent descent angles. Again, we're noticing a trend here, and also with my sink rate. So I'm just going to go ahead and start scrubbing through this flight. And what I'm curious is, looking at the 3D cockpit view, how did I do keeping myself on the center line, which is depicted by the magenta line here, and how did I do with my vertical descent? Like, was I consistent? Was I feeling pretty good about that? So we're just going to quickly scrub through this flight. We see a little bit of a red section here where I'm fast. and I'm a little bit on the low side as I'm coming up on the final approach fix. We cross the final approach fix. This is where the flaps come out. I'm holding my 85 to 90 knots pretty nicely, maybe a little bit on the slow side. We dip below 1,000 feet here. I'm still a little bit slower than I'd like to be. I'd like to be at 90 knots. Right now, I'm only at 80. And then I level off. I realize my speed is not where I wanted it to be, so I let the plane speed up a little bit. I hold that center line, and then I reach my missed approach point, and off we go. So I was 1,750 feet just over the airport. This is about where I executed my missed approach. We'll go to the next approach, 6 Bravo 6, the RNAV runway 21. I flew this as a T approach, starting at the Axite initial approach fix. And we'll do the same sort of thing here. We'll just scrub through this flight. Looks like I had some crossing altitude issues again. I was consistently flying below the restriction, or below the altitude that I should have been for the crossing altitudes. That's something I'll definitely have to go back and think about. I believe that's something I went and worked on the next time I went up. Scrub our way through the flight. Same sort of thing. We're looking at any sort of overcorrections or deviations. I turned in a little bit early coming into the intercept here, but I did manage to get myself centered up nicely as we approach the final approach fix. At the final approach fix, holding 90, 95, 80 to 90 knots, still getting a little bit slow on the way down, tracking nicely, not having to overcorrect, and then we start the missed approach. And finally, the localizer approach into Beverly. As I mentioned, these approaches were all identified automatically. All of the approaches were loaded into CloudAhoy automatically, so all I had to do was upload this data from ForeFlight, and now I'm looking at it again, or I'm looking at it, and it's complete. And we'll do the same thing here. This time, I did a very good intercept on this localizer. I didn't overshoot it. I didn't come in too early. I felt pretty good about how I turned in. We crossed the final approach fix. You can see the nose does dip up. We do gain just a little bit of altitude here as the flaps come out, but not too much. And then make my descent. And this time I'm still running 80 to 85 knots. Now we're starting to find closer to 90 knots. Level off for the minimums there, and then grab the airport and on our way in. So all three of those approaches I feel were flown pretty well. I definitely needed to go and look at my crossing altitude restrictions, make sure that I'm flying those properly. But overall, I was very happy with how well I flew all three of those approaches. So let's talk about beyond currency. The last two flights were primarily dealing with me getting current again, me getting legal to fly. Let's think about what else can we do with CloudAhoy. So I also record all of my flights, including very, very long cross-country flights. This picture was taken flying down to Pittsburgh from the Boston area. I try to debrief all my flights in as little time as possible, because honestly, none of us have a ton of time. Probably 9 out of 10 flights I fly, I'm debriefing in 2 to 3 minutes or less. I do, however, find that by looking at every one of my flights, there's always something to learn. So this is a routine cross-country flight that I flew. I flew out of the Beverly Airport down to Norwood. It was a very, very short flight, only about 25 or 30 miles. And I flew this because I didn't want to sit in traffic. I had a meeting to take down in Norwood. It would have been 2 hours in the car each way, or it would have been 20 minutes by airplane. So I felt pretty good about that. But the main consideration here as we're flying around Boston is just airspace avoidance. We're flying underneath the Bravo shelf that's 3,000 feet. We're flying over the top of some deltas, that are 2,600 feet, and go from there. And also on this particular flight, my observation was some issues in the traffic pattern of all places. So open this flight up, and we'll pretty quickly take a look at this guy. So the flight starts off, we're looking at the approach into Norwood. Couple of observations here. I'm going to go back in time just a little bit. So we're going to click and drag, go back in time, and zoom in here on this. And what do we see here? We see a dip in the altitude followed by a hump, followed by an actual descent. And the hump is precariously close to a beam the numbers, which is, of course, where the flaps come down. So my first observation coming out of this flight, when I went the first notch of flaps in my Cessna 182, I gained about 100 to 200 feet. That was not ideal. So I needed to be more aggressive about pushing over on that yoke as we were coming in. Also, looking at this pattern, I was given a downwind entry, and I probably should have started my downwind entry a little bit wider as opposed to starting it tight and then turning in. So now I'm sort of flying away from the airport as we make our way out and begin the turn to base. And turn to base, turn to final. As I turned around on final, I realized I was 600 feet turning on short final. Definitely a little bit on the high side. I had a nice rounded base here because I was also fast coming around the corner, and then made my way in. So we'll see a steep start of the descent here. which eventually shallows out, and I ended up coming in fairly nicely by the end of this. But if we look at the score breakdown, yeah, descent angle consistency is again one of those things. And this is one of the things I need to go talk to an instructor and work on, because I have a tendency on base to final to come in high and then get myself kind of caught up on the glide path. So that's something that I wanted to look at, and something that came out of this flight. In addition, if we wanted to look down in our bottom right corner here, we can scrub through this flight and we can make sure that, okay, there were no issues with airspace. There was no instance down here where I would have intercepted the airspace or maybe I got a little close to comfort there to that 2,000 foot Bravo shelf. But for the most part, I followed my highway around the city. I followed my airspace, and I was able to stay pretty clear of that stuff without any real problems. If you're ever in the Boston area, by the way, this is a beautiful flight to do. Flying just 2,800 feet right around the Bravo shelf. Just an absolutely stunning view. So for the experienced pilot, to summarize, CloudAhoy is still useful for us. It allows us to be a better and safer pilot. We can use the tool to identify trends. We can look for repeated mistakes. We can identify bad habits, and we can also look at the good points as well. This allows us to work on focused instruction the next time we talk to an instructor. So the next time when I start my commercial training here very soon, you can be sure that my sight picture on final is something that I'm going to talk about, because that's something I've been able to identify as consistently a problem with my flying. So we can have focused instruction the next time we go in for a currency check, next time we go in for our BFR, or anytime we're going in to work with a flight instructor for any reason. So let's talk about flight training. For students and CFIs, CloudAhoy is especially useful. The automatic segmentation allows us to very quickly identify different maneuvers that were flown throughout the flight. If we fly a lot of steep turns, we can go break down and see each one of those steep turns. We can get scoring back from CFI Assistant, an objective view as to how you did on your flight. However, scoring does not replace a human CFI. We've had some people that are afraid that, are you trying to get rid of us? And absolutely not. Some of the parameters we can measure, airspeed, altitude, and things of that nature. But we all know that flying is more than tracking needles. You know, things like having a death grip on the yoke. We don't want to have that. So that's a case, like there's a lot of cases where we want the CFI to be there to teach the student the touch that you need for flying and how to get comfortable in the airplane. To quote one of our advisory CFIs, Nate Weinsaft, CloudAhoy CFI Assistant, this is what happened, and a human CFI tells you this is why it happened. So let's take a look at some pattern work at Lawrence Municipal. This is again a flight that I did. This was probably my 4th or 5th flight in my flight training, and I did this as a pre-solo student. We did 11 laps around the pattern, and what we'll see is we had some good laps and we had some bad laps. If we start by looking at scoring, we'll see that scores started off in the low to mid 60s. They did improve into this mid 70s. I even had an 84 at one point before we sort of went off the cliff. This is a good way to visualize that I started off, at a baseline. I generally got better, with the exception of this one, which of course we're going to look at that. I generally got better, and then I hit a point where flight training was over. We're done. We're not getting any more out of this. And after this last approach, it was a mutual decision that, hey, this is probably where we should call it quits. So let's take a look, first of all, at the low scoring approach, or the low scoring pattern, I should say. So I'm going to bring this entire pattern up. We have the pattern altitude and the pattern speed down here. In the upper right-hand corner, we have that similar information, but it's broken down into a smaller segment. And you can see just a nice, beautiful climb here in the green as we got up to 1,100 feet. I will say I was not quite squared up on my crosswind leg, but I still felt pretty good about that. I maintained my 1,100-foot pattern altitude pretty well all the way around the patch. We got to beam the numbers, started bringing the speed back, and then down we went. So where did it all fall apart? Well, if we break our score down here, I could see that, altitude below 500 feet was an issue. And I could see that labeled here in red. I'm trying to aim for 65 plus knots. And in this case, I was actually running a couple of knots below 65. And that's a case where we want to fly precise. We want to fly, closer to the mark. So I definitely struggled with speed. I struggled with descent angle. Imagine that. I was still coming in high. I was still coming in, I was still starting off high to get myself back down on the glide path. So this is obviously something that is not a new problem for me, or not a new observation for me, I should say. And then making our way in for what was a beautiful stop and go landing. So how about the good one? Let's take a look at the 84 here. So we'll go ahead and move over to the 84. We'll show that entire pattern. And we'll take a peek at that. So we can once again see a nice climb here, climbing up at our VY speed, making our way all the way up to 1,100 feet, keeping a nice pattern on the way around. Still, decently well squared. I did turn in a little bit early in this case. And then as we make our way, flaps come down, we start to turn towards base. Just a nice, beautiful. In this case, I kept the speed up. I kept the speed as opposed to being 63, 64 knots. I'm now running 68 to 69, 70 knots. And I felt a lot better about being faster on that particular leg than I did the first time, where I was, definitely too low and too slow. And my instructor looks at me and he's like, what the heck are you doing? You get a little bit slow at the end there, but that's not really a huge deal. A nice, beautiful landing coming in. And we could go back and we could evaluate the rest of these patterns if we wanted to. We can use the flight graph down here. We can see how consistent the altitude and the speed were as we were coming up and coming back down. But overall, my pattern work was okay for where I was at the time. So very, very helpful to go back and talk about this and look at it as a student pilot with your CFI. So if we fast forward a few months, now we go to my Checkride Prep flight. A lot of maneuvers here, had some engine out practice in here. And just some overall good stuff to cover. So for my Checkride Prep flight, I generally felt pretty good about how I flew. However, I will recognize that there were some issues I had with my engine out portion of my prep. So I'm just going to skip straight to the engine out. We're going to talk about that in one other maneuver. So let's go ahead and filter out the descent. Let's grab the missed approach here, and we'll grab the first part of the actual missed approach. And I'm going to change our main view to the 3D cockpit view so we can visually see how high and fast I was. Let's zoom in on our small view down here, and we'll just lock that up. So we've got a nice 2D view, we've got a nice 3D cockpit view, and we've got our graph over here as well. So this is an engine out procedure. If I start scrubbing through, you'll see the speed is 100 knots just nicely, and then instructor pulls the power, hit best glide, and start my way down. So the airport, if you can see it, is just over here off the left of my eye. So I'm coming up to beam the airport fairly soon, and I'm already 1,450 feet. So I can already sense that maybe energy management is going to be an issue as we're coming down the pipe here. So we're still coming down. 500 feet, make my turn to base. So we can see the airport. Oh, we can't see the airport. Now we can see that the airport, very, very tiny runway, 2,100 feet long, and I swear it's about 3 feet wide. Coming down the pipe here, and recognized as I was turning base that I'm 270 feet and 70 knots over top this field. There is pretty much no chance that I'm actually going to make that landing. So I opted as the student pilot to execute a go around. My instructor looked at me, and I don't think he was too happy with me. So he did give me another opportunity to prove myself doing my power off descent, but he actually made me do it 2 more times just to prove that I could. And we managed to do much better later in the flight. The next thing I wanted to talk about, though, was my turn on a point. So let's switch to a left turn on a point. This is an example of a maneuver that is not scored, but it is still identified. So we're looking at my left turns on a point here. I'm keeping a water tower off my left wing here. If I zoom in, you can see the water tower right there. That was the center point of what I was doing at 1,000 feet here. And we'll just go ahead and scrub through this really quickly. We'll see a nice wide turn. Then my instructor looks at me and says, you got to get a little closer than that. So then we jump in and we get a little bit closer. Generally trying to hold around 900 to 1,000 feet. I was a little bit low at times. I was a little bit high at times, but for the most part, I flew it well enough that he signed me off at least. And the speed was hanging in there, and overall, a decently well flown turn on a point. So we don't have to use scoring to identify. We have more than just scoring when we're looking at maneuvers here as well. Let me take a look at the rest of the flight, and you can kind of get an idea of what he put me through. Here's the engine out he finally made me do after a couple of steep turns, which he was happy with. So that was my Checkride Prep. So let's talk about a couple more examples. I mentioned rich data. So in addition to pulling data from ForeFlight and interpolating the indicated airspeed based on the ground speed and wind data that we have, we can also pull data directly from several high-profile avionics packages. The biggest example is the Garmin G1000. It records to an SD card that sits on the right side of those units, and it records a whole slew of data. Everything from the indicated airspeed, the barometric altitude, each of the cylinder head temperatures, and quite a bit more. We can get data from a Garmin G3X. We can get data from a Garmin G5. We can also pull data from Avidyne IFDs, Dynon Avionics, and a whole lot more solutions out there. We also have the ability to pull in data from flight simulators and get some rich data. We have a product that we're working on specifically for X-Plane that we're hoping to roll out at some point in the future. Back to the topic of Garmin, we're working with our partner AirSync, which allows airplanes to upload that data automatically. So using an AirSync device, when the flight is finished, it automatically pulls all the data off of that SD card, uploads it to the AirSync servers, and then uploads it to your CloudAhoy account. Ideally, to have it ready for you to debrief by the time you step into the FBO and are finished with your flight. So we're going to take a quick look at a Garmin G1000 example here. This is a view of, as I mentioned, rich data. Not only do we have more data, but we have more accurate data. We have access to data that, like the best GPS data that you're going to get is what comes directly off of the avionics. So we'll take a peek at that. This is looking at an ILS approach coming into the Portsmouth Airport in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. This was flown in a Cessna 172. Most of the approach was flown on autopilot, so we are less concerned with how well the approach was flown. We're going to focus more on what kind of additional data we can get from the approach. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the play button. We'll set it for 4x speed, and we'll see the flight start to come in. I'll pull your attention to the 3D cockpit view that is up here in the upper right-hand corner. You will have noticed the CDI has now come in, the diamond here in the center, showing us our lateral guidance. As we get closer to the final approach fix, we'll see something similar with our glide slope indication on the right side here. You can also see our rich gauges on the left side that have our engine RPM setting, as well as our actual indicated airspeed, not the computed airspeed, our barometric altitude. And if I fast forward this flight just a little bit, now we're going to go ahead and see the glide slope start to come in. We'll see that engine RPM still doing what it's doing. The pilot is definitely fighting the air. And as we intercept the glide slope, nose is going to come down, and we'll see that engine RPM start to come back. So if I pause that there, this is an opportunity to talk about our flight graphs. So we've looked primarily at altitude and airspeed for the time being as far as flight graphs, or as far as our flight graphs go. But all of the parameters of the G1000 can also be tossed onto a graph and looked at in CloudAhoy. So in the flight graphs menu, if we click on the hamburger button, we get access to all of the data points that are recorded. So the G1000 is giving us our cylinder head temperatures. Well, we'll go ahead and pull that out. We can see all 4 of the cylinder head temperatures are mapped on this particular graph now. I can pull this out, and what I'm actually interested in looking at for this approach is my engine RPM. So I can see my engine RPM settings now visually, and so we can see that point where we're at 2300 RPMs, and where the pilot pulls the power out down to 1800 RPMs. We'll see the pilot holds 1800 to 1900 RPMs. They recognize at some point here that they're a little bit on the fast side. So we see our airspeed's 107 knots, should be probably closer to 90. So they pull the power out down to 1500 RPMs. That airspeed starts to bleed off, and then they put some power back in for the remainder of the approach. Airspeed graph, or the engine RPM graph in particular, can be very useful for students that are a little handsy on the throttles. I've talked to some flight schools that have used this data, and they've had very good success by looking at approaches and saying, here's where you're holding too much power on the throttle. Here's maybe where you're not holding enough, or here's just where you're oscillating, that you're playing with the throttle too much. So there's a lot of parameters and whatnot, a lot of data that we can pull out of those G1000s. I'm not a CFI, so I won't speak to the nuances of all of them, but there's definitely some good information there. Finally, we're going to take a look at a Redbird simulator flight. Very similar to the G1000 flight that we saw. This was the deep practice PPC scenario that you can fly as part of the virtual pilot proficiency center. And I just want to show this because there's a few additional parameters that we have in the Redbird sim. In some cases with some G1000 installations we also get, but not all of them. We have access still to the RPM information. We have access to now engine power settings. We also have access to our flaps up here as well. So I can tab through this flight. This was flown in a flight simulator and debriefed with CloudAhoy, flown by one of our esteemed CFIs, Greg, up in Maine. And we can just visualize coming down the pipe. We can see the autopilot's flying it right now, and the autopilot is oscillating a little bit left to right, but it's not too bad. It's mostly holding that center line. It's holding the glide slope really, really well. You can see we're at 10 degrees of flaps now. Now 20, now 30. So here's where the flaps come out. Here's where our wonderful pilot takes over and then brings us in for a fantastic landing. So this was recorded rich data directly from the Redbird simulators. If you set up a Redbird account, you can configure your Redbird account to automatically upload those flights to CloudAhoy. So as soon as this flight was finished, it got uploaded to CloudAhoy and it was ready to be debriefed by the time you turned the sim off. So let's talk about wrapping things up. We have a couple of projects that we're working on that are in development, work in progress, beta, whatever moniker you want to use to talk about them. We're currently working very closely with the US Air Force on setting up formation flights. You can see here in the top right-hand corner an example of 2 debriefs being shown side by side of 2 military pilots that were flying in formation. We're also working with the Air Force on building out a comprehensive aerobatics platform. So not only identifying aerobatics approaches or maneuvers, but also being able to grade those maneuvers as well. I don't have a fancy animation of one of those, but I found a spot where the plane was upside down, and I was pretty happy with that. And then finally, we're working on automated integrations with many of our partners. Folks at EAA may be familiar with the skill score. That is one example of a partner using our system through our API. But this is just more ways to get CloudAhoy data in the hands of other applications and give you more ways to access and use your CloudAhoy data. So, contact us. You can reach out to me directly, ty@cloudahoy.com. You can reach out to our team via team@cloudahoy.com. In most cases, I'll probably be the one that responds to you. If you'd like to get some self-service help, you can head over to help.cloudahoy.com and go through our comprehensive help files that cover every aspect of our application. Finally, if there's something in the system that you notice in the moment, please do click on the feedback button in the upper left-hand corner. Let us know what you were doing. When you click on this button, it goes into our ticket system. It includes a link to the flight that you're debriefing, and we read and respond to every single one of these. So I wanted to show something fun here in closing. In 2013, our founder, Chuck, had an opportunity to fly to Oshkosh. It was a 5-day trip to get himself out there with a couple of people. It was also his last opportunity to fly to Oshkosh, as the very next year, CloudAhoy had its very first ever booth. So it's 2020, and we found this flight again by searching for Oshkosh in the Flights tab. This is 2013's flight data recorded using only a GPS. We're able to now get better analysis on that flight. We're able to get scoring on that flight, and we're also able to utilize a feature we added after the flight was flown by syncing up a video feed that was recorded during the approach. We're going to go ahead and play this flight back, and we're going to watch Chuck flying into Oshkosh, something that personally I would love to be able to do someday. Thank you again to those of you who tuned in after the fact. If you do have any questions, feel free to contact us via the methods on the previous slide. Email, our ticket system, click the feedback button, or maybe find us next year at Oshkosh 2021, where we are hoping to meet as many of you as possible. Thank you very much, and we will see you all very, very soon.